Yeah, welcome. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to The Paper Plane. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, where I interview folks I am blessed and honored to share community with, asking them about a book or books that have had a transformative impact on their lives. And in a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, and LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus, especially BIPOC folks. This space imperfectly aims to operate as a counter-narrative to those things. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Today's guest is a dear brother of close to 3 decades. We met on the local basketball court in the 6th grade via our mutual childhood friend, Ronnie Lang, whom we dedicate this episode to and who heartbreakingly passed from cancer a little over a decade ago. We love you, Cap. On the hoop court in the Richmond Annex as kids, we were affectionately known as the Asian Steve Kerr and Latino Khalid El-Amin, which is fucking hilarious if you know 90s basketball, and have had each other's backs through countless moments of waves of good, bad, and ugly. My guest today is an uncle to my children, the godfather of my daughter Mayari, and a Dominoes and Magic the Gathering aficionado whose confidence in these arenas mirrors that of Marshawn Lynch being handed the ball at the 1 yard line. This is a person who I accompanied to Oracle Arena to witness Steph Curry hit his 400 three-pointer in the Warriors 73-win 2017 season, and when we took a picture together with the championship trophy, and the photographer said, "Sir, please don't touch the trophy," he sucked his teeth and replied, "I'm from Richmond." My guest today is an extremely knowledgeable, talented, and brilliant real estate agent and leader and mentor with and for many in this realm. He agrees with the United Nations that housing is a human right, is hypervigilant as it pertains to issues of social justice and supporting historically dispossessed communities of color in the Bay Area, and I am honored to have him on today here at the Paper Plane. Victor Reyes is an immigrant-born naturalized citizen hailing from Lima, Peru. He and his family migrated to the U.S. when he was only 5 years of age. His family settled in Miami for a couple of years before moving to the Bay Area, specifically Richmond, California, where he grew up. Yee! Prior to venturing into the real estate industry, Victor had honed his skills and expertise through an 8-year career in sales and service and 6-year career in logistics. In 2015, he took a pivotal step into the real estate arena, joining a highly effective team in Lafayette, California, where he served as a transaction coordinator, broker's assistant. Victor's journey endowed him with a wealth of knowledge and experience and an invaluable asset that he brings to his clients in the diverse and dynamic Bay Area markets. Victor's desire is to empower his clients to realize their dreams of home ownership by providing relentless support and expertise. Beyond his professional endeavors, Victor remains deeply committed to his community and various organizations. He actively contributes to the California Association of Realtors and the Contra Costa Association of Realtors. Notably, he served as the former president of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals East Bay chapter and currently serves as the founding president of the National Hispanic Organization of Real Estate Associates East Bay chapter, NHORA. Victor's dedication extends to supporting organizations like the Reyes Center, which plays a pivotal role in creating safe spaces for youth in Richmond, California. His multifaceted commitment to bettering the lives of those around him exemplifies his unwavering passion and dedication. And it is with that I am so happy and honored to have my dear brother, my bro Montana, my bro Pac Shakur, my bro Sidon, my broski with the moski, Victor Reyes. Welcome to the Paper Plane, bro. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, brother. Thank you for having me. Appreciate you. Appreciate
Yeah.
you a lot.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. You know, another day, another dollar, as they say here in the Bay. So,
Indeedy. Absolutely. For today, y'all, Victor has chosen a remarkable text. And so The book that we're going to be discussing today is The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. This is a 2017 book by Richard Rothstein on the history of racial segregation in the United States. The book documents the history of state-sponsored segregation stretching back to the late 1800s and exposes racially discriminatory policies put forward by most presidential administrations in that time, including liberal, quote-unquote, presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The author argues that intractable segregation in America is primarily the result of explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels, also known as de jure segregation, rather than the actions of individuals or private companies or de facto segregation. Among other discussions, the book provides a history of subsidized housing and discusses the phenomenons of white flight, blockbusting, and racial covenants and their role in housing segregation. Rothstein wrote the book while serving as a research associate for the Economic Policy Institute, where he is now a distinguished fellow. The book has been reviewed many times and was received with critical acclaim, among other honors. It made the long list of the 2017 National Book Awards, was placed at number 4 on Publisher Weekly's top 10 best books of 2017, and won Rothstein the 2018 Hillman Prize for Book Journalism. It went on to become a bestseller during the mid-2020 resurgence of national interest in racial injustice following the George Floyd protests. As of December 20th, 2020 issue, the book has spent 32 total weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And so, Vic, I'm so excited to kind of, hear your thoughts on this really important text. And my opening question is, pretty wide open, but why is The Color of Law an important text to you, and what journeys would you say that it's taken you on?
Yeah, man. Geez. Yeah, this was a great book, great read. Um, I think when I read the book, it was probably like 80% not new to me. I think I think growing up with you and then growing up with others in the areas of education and also just living in the Bay Area, we kind of understand like discrimination, racial discrimination in terms of housing and stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff wasn't new, but some of it was. And I think it was important to kind of understand its history and where it came from. So it allowed me to follow the breadcrumbs easier as to where we are today. So that's kind of what's important. And then the other thing is too, I know that, we live in California, so there's always this whole thing like, especially in the Bay Area where we're kind of like in this bubble where we feel like we're so liberal. And yet a lot of these discriminatory housing policies came from the Bay Area in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just kind of shows us that, there's still, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
In particular too, because like we grew up in Richmond, right? And so growing up in Richmond, there was a lot of questions that I just could not figure an answer to. And one of the things that I'll say, for folks that haven't read the book or want to read the book is, if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you probably heard, especially in like South Richmond, right? Like South 36, right? There was a store called Frank's.
Mm.
If you didn't know what Frank's was, this is a this was a liquor store literal in the middle of a block of a residential area. It was all residential area, and it was just a liquor store in the middle of a block. And it was so odd. It just always stood out as a sore thumb. And I never understood how that happened or, how that came to be until I actually read Color of Law. And then I actually had a better understanding of Richmond too. Like most folks don't understand that Richmond was actually a majority white city before it became a Black and brown city as it is now. So, so it's just a whole history in terms of discrimination and the changes, especially in particular too, because it talks a lot about the Bay Area as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I heard you kind of touching on some of this already, but well, first and foremost, I forgot to say to our listeners, spoilers will abound around this book if you have not read. So putting on that, but right, so wanted to kind of speak about some particular topics, and those include redlining, generational wealth, home ownership, gentrification, displacement, the role of real estate professionals, affordability, equity, modern mortgage lending, and kind of paths forward potentially, and some of your thoughts on these things in line with these themes in the book. But beginning with redlining. So The Color of Law details how government sanctioned redlining shapes racial segregation in cities across the United States. And I'm curious, how have you seen the legacy of these policies in the Bay Area's real estate market today?
It's still segregated. It
Yeah.
continues to be. So that's the biggest problem. There are a lot of good organizations out there I would say the Othering and Belonging Institute and out of UC Berkeley does a lot of good work in terms of housing discrimination. In fact, I think it was them and some other institutions as well that put redlining maps. And if you can compare the redlining maps from the past into today, they're still very much look very similar. There have been some changes, obviously, but it's still a lot of that segregation. So we still have it, and it's a huge battle to kind of, I guess, integrate or kind of remove the segregation that has been in place, because segregation has been enforced by not just like one organization. It's been enforced by various different groups all acting in one. And so that kind of issue is still causing a problem. And so, and it's also the mentality of humans, right? So there have been a couple of things that have happened in recent times, which kind of still show the continuance of redlining and steering and things like that. So the first would be the Long Island incident. So if you're not aware, this is like super easy, like Google search, you pull up like Long Island realtor or real estate incident, and you'll see something from Newsday that'll come up. And basically what it was is, in New York, it's a one party state, meaning that one party can be recorded and the other party doesn't have to know. We don't have that in California.
Okay.
And so they sent in some folks to basically go in to talk to real estate agents, very much with the same profile, meaning like a white couple and a black couple going in looking for real estate in Long Island. And they were treated very differently.
Yep.
Obviously the real estate agents were professional and things of that nature, and yet somehow they were steered into different directions based on their, race, ethnicity, et cetera. And so it goes to show that there's still discrimination. Mm-hmm. And another recent incident as well, too, is in appraisals. And that has always been longstanding as well, too. And this is actually close here in Marin County. There was a case a few years ago with the Austin family where they got their home appraised. It came in a little under $1 million. And then when it got reappraised, it was around 1.4 million, right? Once they removed all their things that, showed that they were a black family inside the home, and then had a white family going. And so they did all these things, and it just shows that, the discrimination is still alive. And that's such a, very explicit discrimination, because we're talking about a $500,000 difference in appraisal in terms of, this one family being impacted. But I mean, we can talk about that, but how do we kind of alleviate the more subtle discrimination where it isn't $500,000, it's more like 20, 30,000, which still has a large impact on families, right?
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, and I remember hearing about these things, but yeah, for reminding me. And if you are listening and you are not from the Bay Area, there's a very specific way, particularly those of us who grew up in the East Bay, have a way of thinking about Marin County as far as like being more affluent and more, frankly, white out there. And all over the Bay, there's you'll find pockets of that. I mean, like Orinda, for example, is like that in the East Bay, but just to give a little context to our folks not from the Bay, if you are from the Bay, specifically the East Bay, I would say, and you hear something like this happening in Marin, you would be like, give a knowing nod and smile, and it wouldn't feel surprising. And in line with some of these things, right? So, because what this ultimately does, and you and I have talked, extensively about these things for a long time, right? Is it robs families, individuals, communities of color of generational wealth, right? And I say that, as somebody who is living in my late Bachan Jichan's home in El Cerrito, right? And, largely a big part of why this house, even exists is because of reparations money after the Japanese American incarceration camps, right? And so all these different things being tied to historical laws and policies, right, that shift things in different directions for people around generational wealth, right? And so one of Rothstein's key arguments in this book is that federal housing policies denied Black and Latinx families the opportunity to build generational wealth. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, in your mind, what specific barriers still exist for first-time homebuyers of color in the Bay Area? And how does NHORA work to address these challenges? And again, sorry for just to remind folks, NHORA is the National Hispanic Organization of Real Estate Associates East Bay chapter. that Vic is the serving president for?
Past president, yes,
Oh,
it's
okay,
Nora.
hold on.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, Jesus, there's so many different ways in which folks that come from underserved communities have been robbed of generational wealth, and it's tough. I mean, nowadays, where you try to, get into even the housing market, you need to find affordable housing,
Yeah,
right? And particularly in the Bay Area, where it is very costly just to get into a home, that's very
astronomical.
difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult for families to even be able to do so. And so, we try to find ways to do it. We do special financing. We try to, find grants and down payment assistance programs to get folks into affordability, but it is really tough. I think at the end of the day, we have to make larger changes. We just have to build more housing, and
Hmm.
that's one of the big key things. And a lot of the times when we think about building houses, we think, because I say it that way, most people think, oh, just build more single family homes. I also think density is important as well, too, right? We
Hmm.
can't just continue to build single family homes, especially in a metropolitan area like the Bay Area, where there's so many individuals living here. We need to find density. We need to be able to
Uh,
find the multifamily units. We need to be able to build those multifamily units here so we can sustain a lot of the people that are living here. We need to create better access to credit. This is also really
uh,
important that impacts the Black and Brown communities. So, for instance, there's a lot of renters here, right? And so you
mhm.
pay rent, but how come rent is not one of the things that is actually looks good on your credit? That should be something that be implemented. Imagine how many
Absolutely.
renters would have good credit scores if the payment that you make on a monthly basis would actually account towards your credit. That
Wow.
would actually
I've never
open a
thought
lot of
about that.
things.
That's so real.
Those are just like a couple of things that I could say in terms of just like making it easier for underserved communities to just gain these types of accesses to be able to get into home ownership, specifically in the Bay Area. And so, Nora, the organization that I'm a part of, what I like about their work is that they're here to give out information. And so, one of our things that we do with all our chapters on a national level, we're not across the 50 states yet. We're still kind of a young organization. But
Mm,
one of the things that we do is we provide a road to home ownership. And what
mm,
that breaks down to is a home buyer basically consultation or a home buyer, um, yeah, like a home buyer consultation in which we're giving you resources in terms of, hey, where you can find funding, where you can find grants, and prepare you to taking a step into home ownership because it is a big step. It's a more importantly, it's a financial step, right? You have
yeah.
to have some sort of financial literacy. You have to have an understanding of, creating a budget and living within your budget, living within your means. I know for a lot of us, it's really difficult to do that, especially in a high priced area like
Mm,
the Bay Area and stuff like that. And so we want to educate you in those ways. And then, of course, get you all the resources. Sometimes what ends up happening, is, especially in California, we end up giving out programs like the Dream for All program, which was a program that came out the first time around and the second time around. First time for 700 million, I believe. The second time for $200 million, in which a program like that goes away really fast. The first time around, I
uh,
think 700 million was exhausted in, I think, 9 to 11 days. So it
yeah.
just it just goes to show how many Californians are looking for housing and need housing, and so there's a massive shortage. But in order to take advantage of these programs that come in so fast, is you have to be prepared. So what I would say is align with different organizations that kind of get you into that home ownership readiness so that you can take advantage of it once a program does come out, so you're not waiting, because by the time that program comes out, you're too late already. It's gone.
Mm, wow. Whew. Yeah, my mind's like going in a number of different places, but I'm kind of thinking about so, kind of what we're talking about right now, right, is like you're talking about different, kind of supports that your organization is trying to do for folks who are trying to, become first time homeowners, right? And then, in thinking about historically in the Bay Area, right, there's also, I'm thinking about Oakland right off the top of my head, but like when it comes to or Richmond, right? But just like when it comes to gentrification and displacement, right? There's all these folks who have been here and actually own homes, but are like being pushed out, right? Also, right? So when it comes to the institutional kind of racial injustice, many historically marginalized communities in the Bay are now facing gentrification. And so I'm wondering, do you think today's housing policies are doing enough to prevent displacement, or are they more in the direction of reinforcing historical patterns of exclusion and oppression?
Yeah, that's man, that's tough. Gentrification is such a hard thing to stop and prevent, just for the simple fact that what we're talking about is displacing people that are currently in an area that they've been inhabiting, and most of the time, most of the work that the policies and these cities and just like governments and organizations put in place is generally disrupting the ecosystem that is already there.
Hmm.
So it's not like we're investing to make these properties better. It's not like we're giving money to these people already in the community to like make their homes better so they could be valued higher or things like that. We're not doing
Yeah.
any of those things. I think we're actually doing the opposite. We're actually, in many ways, like Oakland, for instance, I would say we're creating opportunity zones in which these specific areas, a person can come in and spend less money to get into a home. These properties, are easier access, but then you're also displacing people that are from there. So I think gentrification is such a hard issue and such a hard topic to kind of cover it. And I personally don't know of any ways that I haven't heard of anything that has kept the current inhabitants in the areas and still kind of develop, because most of the time when you're opening, let's say like a commercial, like let's say you put coffee shops or things like that to kind of make the environment better, generally it uplifts the cost of everything, right? That
Hmm.
coffee price is going to go higher. And then these people that are already
Yeah.
inhabiting these areas can't afford that.
Yeah.
So it always is a disruption in terms of what's already there. So I really do think that's like one of the hardest topics to tackle in terms of
Yeah.
the real estate industry and what segregation has already created. I think there are two shows that I really kind of like, that I really like, that I enjoy, that I highlight a lot of the gentrification, because a lot of times we think of like gentrification, it's like, oh, like white folks coming into a community like Oakland, like Richmond and things like that, and gentrifying. But it's also, people of different socioeconomic status, and they could look like us,
100%. Absolutely.
you know. And so the first is Gentified, which is a show on Netflix.
Great show.
Dude, it is so good, about this Latino family, and they are living in East LA, I believe, or something like that.
Hmm. Yep.
And yeah, they're just trying to sustain and trying to stay in the community, and it becomes very, very difficult, and they're dealing with their pops and immigration and all these different things. But it does show a little bit of that gentrification within our own community. And then the second show that does that as well too is called Vida, and that's a show
Yeah. Great show.
that about two women who inherit a bar in Boyle Heights. And that's also great too, because they're also trying to sustain that bar and trying to be in that community, in which the entire community is changing. They're
Yeah.
seeing people go, and they're seeing, developers come in, and they look just like, the people that are already living there, but they're different socioeconomic status. So,
Absolutely.
all of those things to show that, gentrification is it's a big issue. It's a big deal, and it's really tough
Yep.
uh, to to handle. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I really appreciate you sharing that because it makes me think of you remember the homie Eden Hikinto?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the homie Eden Hikinto, who Eden, if you're listening, I want to have you on the pod at some point. But Eden is a legal scholar, originally from Long Beach, and doing amazing like immigration law in Los Angeles. But one thing that she says is any it's probably not verbatim, but she said that any analysis of power that lacks a class analysis is no analysis at all, right? And so I really
Mm,
appreciate you naming the piece around class, right? And that it could be like I'm remembering specific moments in Vita, right, where it's like it is like Latinx folks, but not necessarily looking out for folks in the community, but like kind of more on this individualistic tip, and about wealth accumulation um and yeah, and yeah. So yeah, making that
exactly.
differentiation. I appreciate you shining light on that. Um, and when it comes to kind of the role of real estate professionals in, in all the complexities of these things, given the history of government mandated segregation, right? What ethical responsibilities do today's real estate professionals have to counteract these injustices? What policies or practices should agents and brokers advocate for, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think this is also an important reason why you should probably read The Color of Law or any book that has to deal with, like housing discrimination in any way, shape, or form, is so you have an understanding.
Yeah,
And once you have that understanding of historical past, right, and historical, I mean like past, present, and it's still ongoing.
yeah,
It's it hopefully shines a light in terms of what we should be doing. So I think as professionals in the real estate industry as a total, we need to we need to stop steering. Like I mentioned earlier with the whole Newsday Long Island thing, that was a form of steering, right? Steering because of based on race and telling them where they should live because oh, this is more of a community based on your race or whatever, so we shouldn't do these things. That's and that's just wrong. It's illegal. In fact, we made it illegal for a reason. And
mm,
then also by educating yourselves and by taking courses in terms of how to address, because we all have biases and how to address these things and to
yeah,
reduce those things. We can't, there's no way that somebody can just completely stop their own bias, right? That's
yeah,
that's
yeah.
impossible. But there are ways to educate yourself in terms of how to reduce that to a minimum so that when you are, as a real estate professional, when you are guiding somebody to help them make the right decision based on what they want and not necessarily any influence or any bias on your end. So I think that's
Sure.
important. In order to do these things, though, I think as professionals across the board in the real estate industry, we have to have a system. And I think that's super important. A system which is just basically a system that you deal with all your clients all the same. It doesn't
Mm,
matter. It doesn't matter who they are, what they come from. You have a system in which you ask the same, 10 questions to each and every single one.
mm,
And based on that, then you go ahead and deliver your customer service. And I think by creating those kind of systems, it creates a fair system across everyone who comes across,
mm.
your desk in order to purchase a home. And then that's pretty much it. And then don't move away from those things. And I think that kind of becomes difficult when maybe you have a relationship with somebody or you don't, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
this person is much different than you, or blah blah. But like I said, if you have a system that is fair for everyone, then it doesn't matter. At the end of the
Mm,
day, that you have a system that creates fair housing. So.
yeah, yeah. Um, this this is kind of an offshoot. So, a
Yeah.
question that's popped in my mind is kind of like, you know, you've done a lot to educate me around the role of kind of like organizations that specifically honor, support like the affinity of like realtors of color.
Yep.
And so I'm curious, kind of like in your experience, what have been some of the what have been some of the important kind of factors or like, the 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 positive like motivating aspects of those organizations for realtors of color in your experience?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there are a lot of organizations out there doing good work.
Mm,
I will name a few, so for instance, I'm a part of NORA, which is the National Hispanic Organization of Real Estate Associates. We're a community-based organization in which we give back to the community by educating them, giving them resources. We also raise funds for scholarships and things like that. But one of the longest standing organizations actually is the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. And they were one of the first affinity groups. They were the first affinity groups because Black people could not get real estate licenses, could
wow.
not become, in order for them to become brokers, they had to create their own organization. And so they
Mm,
created what is called NAREB, right? And then that is one of the longest organizations. And they also have what's great about them. They also have a Sheba report, and I believe that's for the state. Um, what is it? State of housing in Black America is what it stands for. And basically, they look at all the things that happens with Black Americans and the impact of loans, housing, what is the ratio in terms of how Black home ownership. They're trying to reduce the racial wealth gap between Black and white folks, and so this report is very educational in terms of okay, what do we do moving forward?
Yeah.
And, and some of the things that have come out has actually not been good. I believe the
Hmm.
last Sheba report that came out, I think it said something by 2053, I think the generational wealth for Black Americans will be zero, on average. And
Jesus.
so, yeah. And so that just goes to show that the current system that we're currently living in, if it goes unchecked and we do nothing about it, we're not actively going against it, then it will actually harm Black Americans. So we need to
Yeah.
do things to disrupt it.
Absolutely.
So that's one. And then we have ARIA, the Asian Real Estate Association of America, which is the Asian American group. They do a lot of great work too. They're actually nationwide, just as NARAB is as well too. They look out for Asian Americans. They also look out for home ownership. In that light, we have the LGBTQ, the Rainbow Alliance as well too.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, looking out for folks um, who are non-binary, who are lesbian, bi, et cetera, in order to get home ownership, to get equality into home ownership. The
Mm-hmm.
same thing for differently abled groups as well too. People that
What's
have
up?
have different abilities or disabilities. And so there's a lot of organizations out there working towards equality, working towards home
Yeah.
ownership, equity, access,
Yep.
all of these things. And I feel like it's good to just pick a lane, choose one, and I guarantee you'll probably choose so many different other ones because a lot of it is cross. We are all
Yeah.
trying to we're all trying to get into home ownership. We're all trying to create more home ownership. There's a lot of crossing within those organizations, but it's important to be
Absolutely.
aligned, I think.
That's dope. That's dope. Thank you for that education. I appreciate that, brother. And
Hmm.
you were speaking about affordability and equity, and this is like a depressing part, maybe, but the Bay Area has some of the highest housing costs in the entire nation and the world. Um, in your mind, how do like Rothstein's arguments about historical housing discrimination intersect with the current housing crisis? What solutions might you propose to make home ownership more equitable, or is everything just lost in the Bay Area?
Yeah, man. I mean, just like anything, housing is just like, it falls on the basic principles of economy, right? So, and the principle is supply and demand. So we need more supply because we have a ton of demand.
Right.
I mean, it's great that we have all these like special financing and all this other stuff, but that just creates more demand. It doesn't do
Uh,
anything for the supply chain,
got
right?
it.
And so we just need to build more housing. One of the things that we can do, and we have done actually in California, is change zoning laws, right? So before it would be, a city would be created, and a major part of the city would be single family residential only, meaning you're just building one home on whatever piece of land that you have, right? So now we have the ability to actually, produce more than just the single family residential. And so, but we need to do that. That's the thing. We need to
Yeah.
actually take advantage of these change in zoning laws to actually build, again, more density. The problem with that is that when you try to do these things, and there are groups like, NIMBY, for those who are not aware, the Not in My Backyard, right? Those folks who don't actually want to create density in certain areas, right?
Huh.
Because they feel like it might disrupt or change the composition of a city. But I mean, that is the point. The
Yeah.
city was created to be segregated and
Yeah.
was created with this type of zoning. So by changing the density, the hope is that you allow more diversity into this community, right? You allow more people to come in, and by building more homes, it becomes more affordable because now there's more
Yeah.
properties, right? It just again falls on simple basic economics.
Well, I was going to say, maybe I'm making an assumption here, but NIMBY sounds like some uh, has benefited from white supremacy and segregation for many generations type people. Would you say that my assumption is correct?
Yeah, because think about an entire community, right, that just has single family homes, right? And so let's say a community has, a neighborhood, right? Let's say that has, I don't know, 500 homes in it, and they're all single family homes, right? Why
Mm,
would you want to create more density in that? Because your property is worth so much more. Now,
mm,
if you create more property and more accessibility to that property, then the likelihood of that the home prices falling could slightly happen, right? Even though
mm.
you building density is not the same thing as building a single family house.
Yeah.
However, you do have more people in that area, you do have more foot traffic, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, it they those people that have lived in that community from generations on have actually been able to take advantage of the wealth building that has come through real estate,
Yeah.
right? And most people, because if you're in that neighborhood and you lived in the neighborhood all the time, you don't necessarily feel it. But I always drive with some of my homies in some of these, neighborhoods, and they always say, "Man, I wish my family would have bought in that neighborhood back in the
Mm.
'50s or whatever," right?
Yeah.
And then I always look at them, I'm like, "You couldn't have, you weren't able
Mm.
to
Yep.
buy. Even if you could buy, you weren't able to buy. So you couldn't have built that generational wealth. Your home could not have been worth it. You couldn't have had
Yeah.
that house there." So it
Yep.
goes to show that that's kind of like the impact. And yeah, it is. It is a bit depressing. And yes, they do benefit from those things, but we need to change it. We need to, like I said, we need to change zoning laws. We need to create more density. This will make housing more affordable. And then also too, from, because we live in a world of capitalism, right? People aren't going to build if things aren't, it doesn't make sense financially.
Yeah.
And so in order for these things to happen too, we need to create a rule of law in terms of, how development happens. And by that, I mean, create a system. Again, goes back to systems. Create a system in which, a developer is going in and they need to check off all these boxes and say, okay, I did this. Okay, now how much is it going to cost to build? And
Yeah.
most of the cities, sometimes it's just kind of like based on, whatever one person says, and
Mhm.
there's not necessarily a system. It's just kind of like a one by one basis. And so I think
Mm.
there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of change policy around that to make it to streamline things and to make it easier for everybody to
Yeah.
create more housing.
Yeah, man. Like a few things popping into my head as you're saying these things. Like, I was thinking of there's a book by a scholar, Scott Kurashige, that this book's meant a lot to me, but it's called The Shifting Grounds of Race. And it's essentially about how in Los Angeles, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II, what was Little Tokyo or big parts of it became Brownsville and became, occupied when they left by African Americans. And we see this reflected in the Bay Area in a lot of ways, like you know the film The Last Black Man in San Francisco.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Right. And then so there's that moment where they talk about the Fillmore, right? And how before, because historically we know it, particularly after World War II, as an African American kind of section of San Francisco. But before it, and they even said this in the film, it was Japanese Americans that lived in the Fillmore. And then with the incarceration, they get moved out. Then it becomes, predominantly African American. Um, but I'm like thinking about, you were saying these pieces around like, someone saying, oh, I wish that I bought here in the 50s, and you being like, oh, you like literally couldn't have, right? And like, and thinking about my family landing in Richmond, ultimately after the camps because of redlining and like where you could live and where you couldn't, right? And that's why like my Bachan and Jichan landed in Richmond Annex. Um, but and then in line of institutionalizing segregation, so the Federal Housing Administration or the FHA, right, and think about modern mortgage lending. So the FHA plays this major role in institutionalizing segregation. And I'm wondering, do you see echoes of these discriminatory practices in today's lending industry? I've talked with you, different times about like lending and loans and how incredibly complicated all that is. But um, yeah, do you see echoes of the discriminatory practices in today's lending industry? How can organizations like Nora work to ensure fair access to mortgage loans? And I'm sure it's incredibly challenging.
Yeah, again, one of those things where, the history runs so deep, and we still see it. Like the remnants are always there in anything that we do in housing. And so we have to actively work against it.
Yeah.
So I mean, with that, the practices that you see, like I mentioned today, with the appraisal, appraisals, denial of loans, especially with African Americans as well too. I think their denial of loans is much higher rate than any other race and stuff like that. And so we need to basically create something, again, a system that is fair for everyone. You can't have two people of different races with the same exact financial profile come in and then have two different outcomes. That just to me is just it's unjust, right? It's discriminatory, it's biased. And so this is, again, creating a system in which you remove any type of bias. And the fact is, that the mortgage industry still collects, demographic data, right? Even though
Uh,
when you get a loan application, you can choose not to fill it in. And yet the loan officer still is going to fill it in for you. And so they're still collecting this information, and who knows what they're doing on the back end, if whether they're using it or not.
Huh.
Also, too, where you're filling it from, your zip code may have an impact in terms of
Yeah.
the type of rate that you're getting. And so all these things are, again, just discriminatory, right? We should
Yeah.
just be able to remove these things and just look at somebody's financial profile and be able to get loans and be able to and make sure that they're good loans. And then also too, again, access to credit, right? Be able to
Yeah.
have a good way to actually get credit because, like I said, renting a property could be one. There is a group out in San Francisco Mission. Oh man, I forget the name of the group, but they are doing some incredible work. I'm not sure if you know what tandas are, Colin.
Say it again.
Tandas, you know what a tanda is?
Uh-uh.
Okay, so basically, this is in the Latin community. So you get like, let's say it's five of us, right?
Okay.
And then we get together, and then we all put $100 in the pot, and then we draw straws, and then every month, whoever drew that first straw gets
Oh, I
the
know. I know
five
what you're
hundred
talking about.
dollars,
I know what you're talking about.
right?
Yeah, but
So
keep
that's a
keep
tanda,
keep
right?
going.
Yeah. So this group in San Francisco Mission is actually creating something like that, like a tanda, where you put in money and stuff like that, but it's actually being reported into your credit, so it actually helps build your
Hmm.
credit. So that's incredible work. So again, we need just more
Mutual aid.
access. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So just kind of like, helping each other out, and you get the benefits of that money, and then hopefully again that goes on your record in terms of building credit. So
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of things that we can still do to kind of, create access, especially in the financial industry
Yeah.
as well too, to kind of make it easier for folks to get loans and things like that. And so I mean there's a long way to go, but I mean I think
Mm.
there's a lot of organizations that are doing good work out there. Yeah.
Man, well, that's a really, really perfect segue to the last question before we start slowly closing things out. As far as thinking about a path forward, right? Because, we've discussed a lot of things that, don't necessarily feel super uplifting, right? But, I agree with the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw when she says if you can't see a problem, you can't solve a problem, right? And so,
Mm,
neither of us have ever been the type of people to bury our heads in the sand, because things feel sad, right? Like,
yep.
and so when thinking about a path forward, right? So Rothstein writes this book, right? And I'm wondering, so if Rothstein were advising local policymakers today, what do you think that he would recommend for the Bay Area to repair the damage caused by segregationist housing policies? And also, what steps should real estate professionals, advocacy groups take to support fair housing in the Bay?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's big. So, I mean, in his book, he even kind of mentions it in The Color of Law. He talks about changing zoning policies, which again, California to some extent they have. And they actually, him and his daughter, Leah Rothstein, just wrote a new book.
Ah, okay.
Um, yeah, so they came out, let me see. Yes, so they came out with a book called Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. I still haven't read this book, but it is on
Okay.
my list to read.
Nice.
And they list a few things on there, I guess, in terms of what are the next steps. But
Giving
in
us some
his book,
homework.
yeah, but in his book, The Color of Law, he did say, changes only policies. Again, single family homes is just eating up too much space, and we need to create more denser communities. And then also, I think he mentions talking about, giving back to those impacted by the racial discrimination, particularly Black
Yeah.
Americans and stuff like that, so they can,
Yeah.
hopefully reduce the wealth gap that is,
Absolutely.
that is there. So those are a few of the things too. And as far as like, real estate professionals, become familiar with the historical discrimination because it hasn't gone away. It's just changed. It looks different. Right. And so with the color of law, and this is why, it's important to read is because you understand that, when one thing was shut down, right, you come in and let's say, you couldn't buy in a certain place, then they made it to where, oh, now we're looking at your economics. So now we're going to just build single family homes. And we know that, quote unquote, underserved communities can't afford there. So that's why they build there. That's why. So you can kind of see the chain moving in terms of how it moves from overt discrimination to very subtle, discrimination, right? So now it isn't like, hey, I'm like blatantly discriminating against you. We're just saying, hey, we're financially discriminating. You can't afford to live here. right? So these things are just kind of the continuance and the remnants of those things. So we need to kind of change that. But if you don't become, familiar with these things, then you're just going to continue these kind of same policies. So,
Yeah.
become familiar with them, and then also, help you foresee these things, but then also become involved. I mean, if this is something that's important to you and you feel like, because most real estate agents that I talk to generally do it because they like helping families. They want to help people, especially people that look like them or people from their community, to get into homes. Then,
Hmm.
I think it is important then to, take a step towards that direction and actually,
Yeah.
try to move policy forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you were saying that piece about kind of the like explicit, injustice to the subtle, I was like, I can't remember which rapper said this, maybe you remember, but he was like, I disrespect you respectfully.
Yeah,
That's how it feels, right? As I think
exactly.
about it. But just one last thought I'll share, with regards to kind of like my family's experience too is, and I teach about this in my classes, right, around the model minority myth, right, around Asian Americans specifically, of like, this is the model of like what minorities should do, being quiet and not protesting and just working hard, and then you will, then you will be successful, right? And it's very, subtly anti-black, anti-Latinx, anti-native, on so many different levels. But what it doesn't take into account, right? And I think you've done a really beautiful job today of just reminding us around, is like it's ahistorical, right? It tries to sweep history under the rug, right? Because the reality is that um, you know Japanese Americans, so like my family's experience, right? We get my bachan jichan get my grandparents get $20,000 each as survivors of the incarceration camps. But if your family went through that, and you're there are folks who like lost tons of land or like businesses or homes and properties, and then never got those things back, right? And it like robbed them of tons of generational wealth. And then if you had that experience, but then when in 1988, when this thing gets signed into law, um, if you if your grandparent, your parent wasn't alive, they didn't get any money, right? And so some of the reasoning around this, I would argue, right, as a social scientist, is that because if they did do that, then African Americans could argue we deserve reparations for the institution of slavery, right? Because it's impacted us over generations, right? So one caveat, right, that the government does is they say only people who are still alive today get that money, right? And so I say all that just because we have this home, largely because of some of those things, but also, you know, it's not because we are like more hardworking that Asians are smarter, some of that bullshit, right? Those like whack ass tropes, right? It's because of specific laws and policies, right, that sent us in a different direction. Because a lot of people don't know that prior to 1965, Asian Americans are in the same economic bracket as African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. But 1965 happens, and you have this wave of immigration that brings in all these mostly highly educated professional folks from Asia, that changes things, and I would argue divides a lot of folks in AAPI communities from other folks of color. Um,
Man,
but
100%. Can I add something to that?
no,
I
please,
mean,
please. I wanted to hear any thoughts that came up from you after that.
yeah, no, 100% agree with you. And I think in the color of law, it mentions something like that too, to the effect that because Black Americans have been denied in terms of getting financing for anything, not just homes, but like businesses, et cetera, and other groups have been able to take advantage of those things, it does create that model minority in the sense that you could say, oh, Latinx people, get more loans, or we have more businesses, or Asian have more businesses, et cetera, et cetera. But that's because Black Americans have been excluded from access to that capital. It's
Yeah.
not because for some odd reason, this group is so much better. No, it's been discriminatory policies
Yep.
that hinder Black Americans specifically, right, to be able to create their own wealth. And even when they do, even when they do create incredible incredible cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Yep.
like Rosewood, like
Yep.
oh my God, I can't remember the name in North Carolina. They meet white mob violence. Then they
Yep.
go and destroy state sanctioned, destroyed cities
Hmm.
and where Black wealth is thriving.
Yep.
So we cannot compare this kind of we cannot compare to what has happened and is happening to Black Americans when we're in a different ethnicity group or whatnot,
Mhm.
because it's not the same. And yet we still all have struggles. We all have
Absolutely.
struggles, so we need to band together and fight. But yeah, we still cannot we cannot say that
Absolutely.
um, that we don't that we need to align with Black Americans in order to continue the fighting and struggle. So
I could not agree more. And I think you would agree when, I say that, white supremacy targets, people of color in different ways, right? And also, I agree with the educator Scott Nakagawa, who says that anti-black racism is the fulcrum of white supremacy, right? And he essentially argues that, the more that everybody is able to identify, chip away at, and ultimately end anti-blackness, that the better that things will get for all people involved.
yeah,
Um,
I
well,
agree
and
with that.
yeah, and I thank you so much for repeatedly highlighting that throughout our conversation. And not just kind of like our opinions, which matter very much, but you're linking it to hardcore historical evidence. So thank you so much for that, brother. Um,
Of course,
well, and so as we kind of close things out, and these are two questions or kind of, frames that I end every single interview with. And the first is, and I know, we are music lovers, right? And so the first is, what is a song or a musical artist and or album that you would pair with this book?
mm, man, that's tough.
Take
Uh,
your time.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think when I read
Oh,
this, I always want to hear Kendrick Lamar, "We gonna be all right."
ah,
I like,
love
I
that.
really do. I really do love that. The other thing
Absolutely.
too, I like. Was this is kind of more like for the book itself is "Neighbors" by J. Cole.
Okay.
Because there's a specific line in here where he's like, you have a Trayvon kind of fate, even if your crib sits by the lake, so like you can't escape it, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about his neighbors think he's selling dope and don't follow me, don't follow. That is real. I've
Hmm.
definitely been in some communities where I'm like, man, I don't want the police following me. I don't want nobody following me, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, I would kind of those two tracks. One
Beautiful.
good, one positive, and one kind of like, yeah, still kind of suspect
Yeah.
out here.
Absolutely, absolutely. In my head, I was like, all about my Fetty area codes. um, and then, okay, and then finally, if you could, please complete the following sentence. People should read The Color of Law because dot dot dot.
Because you'll have a better understanding of historical discrimination in the real estate and housing industry, particularly if you are, not a person of color or don't come from underserved communities. This will give you a better understanding of it all. And you'll see how deep the rabbit hole really goes.
Mm.
Um, because it shows that it isn't just an enactment of one or two things. It is literal creations of policies from the federal, state, local levels, organizations, real estate organizations, from realtors, lenders, appraisers, state, local governments, city planning, individual citizens.
Yeah.
The rabbit hole goes deep. So I think this is why you should read it, because it'll give you a
Mm.
full understanding of that. And the hope is that it'll hopefully activate you to do something, about it.
Yeah, beautifully said, man. Brother Vic, such an honor to have you on. Thank you so much for the gift of your time. Love and appreciate you, family.
Thank you, brother. Love you too, bro. Appreciate the time. And yeah, man, this is great. Thank you for having me
Absolutely,
on.
absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. Well, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in this week. We hope that you have a great week ahead, and thank you for being here. And we hope you enjoyed the flight. Peace. Yeet.